Welcome to Silent Crime Case, your trusted source for real-life crime stories. In today's episode, we take you inside the shocking murder of Emily Turner, a decorated Navy officer whose hidden identity and her husband's growing suspicions led to a violent and tragic confrontation. What started as a promising career in the Navy and a seemingly happy marriage ended in bloodshed and betrayal. Let's unravel the disturbing details of this case, which continues to leave its mark on the Jacksonville community. Emily Turner, 29, had everything going for her, at least that's what it looked like on the outside. She had a successful career in the Navy, was married to Daniel Turner, and lived in a quiet Jacksonville neighborhood. But Emily carried a secret that would not only unravel her marriage but lead to her violent death. On April 18, 2019, Daniel Turner called 911 in a state of panic, telling the dispatcher that he had returned home to find his wife dead. What unfolded in the Turner household that morning was far from an accident. It was the culmination of a storm brewing beneath the surface for months, a storm made up of secrets, lies, and a web of insecurities. Emily's carefully guarded past had come to light, sparking a deadly rage in her husband Daniel. Police officers arriving at the scene were faced with a gruesome discovery: Emily's lifeless body, stabbed multiple times and strangled with a leather belt. The brutality of the crime was shocking, even to seasoned investigators. As they dug deeper, it became clear that this was no random act of violence. The motive behind Emily's murder was deeply personal, and the investigators were determined to find out the truth. But this case would lead them down a dark path, one involving hidden identities, growing suspicions, and ultimately, a deadly confrontation that no one saw coming. Emily Turner's life started far from the chaos that would eventually consume it. Born and raised in a small Ohio town, she had always been a determined and ambitious individual. After graduating from high school, Emily joined the Navy, a decision that changed the course of her life. The Navy gave Emily a sense of purpose and belonging. She thrived in its structure, quickly rising through the ranks due to her commitment and discipline. Colleagues described Emily as meticulous, someone who was known for her perfect uniform, attention to detail, and dedication to her duties. She wasn't just a hard worker, she was a role model for others around her. Her work was her life, and she prided herself on being the best she could be. Emily had dreams of one day becoming a commanding officer, and her career trajectory seemed to be heading in that direction. But there was one aspect of Emily's life that no one in her professional world knew about: her past as a transgender woman. Emily had transitioned several years earlier and had gone through the legal processes to change her name and identity. To those who knew her in the Navy, she was simply Emily Turner, a dedicated officer. But her past was something she kept hidden, even from her closest colleagues. Emily feared that revealing her transgender identity could destroy her career, despite recent changes in military policy regarding transgender service members. In 2018, Emily met Daniel Turner, a charismatic car salesman, at a local social event in Jacksonville. Daniel was drawn to Emily's quiet confidence, and their relationship quickly became serious. Within 6 months of dating, the couple got married in an intimate ceremony. Daniel's friends and family saw him as a friendly, easygoing guy who had finally found someone to settle down with. But the whirlwind romance that looked picture-perfect on the outside masked deeper issues. Although Daniel was initially loving and supportive, he soon became suspicious and controlling. He started asking Emily questions about her past, why she hadn't introduced him to her family in Ohio, why she kept certain parts of her life private, and why she seemed distant at times. The seeds of doubt were planted, and they began to fester. Emily, burdened with the fear of her secret being exposed, became more withdrawn, confiding in fewer and fewer people. Kate Lawson, Emily's closest friend and fellow Navy officer, noticed a change in Emily after her wedding. Emily became more reserved, more careful about what she said. She confided in Kate that she was terrified that Daniel might discover her past. Kate, one of the few people who knew about Emily's transgender identity, tried to reassure her, but Emily couldn't shake the fear. She knew that if Daniel found out, it could shatter not only her marriage but her life as she knew it. Daniel, on the other hand, was growing increasingly frustrated. He felt that Emily was keeping secrets from him, and his suspicions began to consume him. The couple's once loving relationship started to break down, and arguments became more frequent. As Emily became more distant, Daniel's need for control grew. He began monitoring her phone, questioning her whereabouts, and pressuring her to open up about her past. The tension in their marriage was palpable, and it was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. On the morning of April 18, 2019, at 7:30 a.m., Daniel Turner's 911 call brought Jacksonville police to the quiet suburban neighborhood where the Turners lived. Daniel, sounding panicked and confused, told the dispatcher that he had returned home from a night out with friends to find his wife unresponsive in their bedroom. When officers arrived, Daniel was outside, pacing and visibly distressed. As officers entered the home, they were met with a gruesome scene. The master bedroom was a chaotic mess, with furniture overturned, sheets torn from the bed, and blood splattered across the walls and floor. Emily Turner's lifeless body lay on the floor near the bed, her hands clenched as though she had fought desperately for her life. She had been stabbed multiple times with office scissors, and a leather belt was wrapped tightly around her neck. It was clear to the responding officers that this was no accidental death. This was a brutal, violent murder. The bedroom showed clear signs of a struggle. Emily had fought back against her attacker, but the brutality of the crime suggested that her killer had been driven by intense rage. The forensics team quickly arrived and began processing the scene, taking samples of the blood spatter, collecting fingerprints and searching for any signs of forced entry. One of the first things detectives noticed was the lack of any signs of a break-in. The front door and windows were intact, with no indication that anyone had forced their way into the home. This suggested that Emily had likely known her killer and had willingly let them into the house, or that the killer had access to the home. Neighbors were interviewed, but none had heard any commotion during the night. One neighbor, however, mentioned seeing Daniel's car pull into the driveway around 7 a.m., just before the 911 call was made. There were no reports of loud noises or arguments, making the crime even more perplexing. The quiet, tree-lined streets of the neighborhood stood in stark contrast to the violence that had occurred behind closed doors. It was the kind of place where families felt safe, where crimes like this were unheard of. But the horror of Emily Turner's murder would soon reveal a darker side to the seemingly idyllic life she and Daniel had led. Detectives John Mitchell and Sarah Lopez arrived at the scene shortly after the first responders. Mitchell, a veteran detective with 15 years of experience, had seen his fair share of violent crimes, but even he was taken aback by the sheer brutality of the attack. Lopez, his younger partner, was relatively new to homicide, but had already earned a reputation for her sharp instincts and ability to connect the dots in complex cases. Together, they began the painstaking process of piecing together what had happened in the Turner home. Their first task was to speak with Daniel. He was still outside, pacing nervously and occasionally glancing back at the house. When Mitchell and Lopez approached him, he seemed genuinely distraught, his voice shaky as he recounted what had happened. Daniel explained that he had been out the night before, drinking with friends at a local bar, and had returned home early in the morning to find his wife dead in their bedroom. He insisted that he had no idea who could have done this, repeatedly saying that his marriage was fine, and that there were no major issues between him and Emily. However, as the detectives listened to Daniel's story, they began to notice subtle inconsistencies. His timeline didn't quite match up, and his demeanor, while outwardly panicked, seemed rehearsed. Mitchell had seen this before, people trying to appear more upset than they actually were, as though they were playing a part. But Mitchell knew that real grief didn't look like this. The detectives asked Daniel about his relationship with Emily. Had they been having any problems? Were there any recent arguments or tensions between them? Daniel hesitated before answering, eventually admitting that they had been arguing more frequently in recent weeks. He said that the arguments were about typical marital issues, money, household chores, nothing out of the ordinary, but Mitchell and Lopez weren't convinced. As Daniel spoke, he became increasingly defensive, especially when the detectives asked if Emily had been keeping any secrets from him. His responses were vague, and he seemed to be avoiding direct answers. Lopez noticed that every time the subject of Emily's past came up, Daniel would deflect, steering the conversation back to their present-day issues. It was clear that there was something Daniel wasn't telling them, but without more evidence, they couldn't make any accusations just yet. Inside the house, the forensics team was busy gathering evidence. They dusted for fingerprints, collected blood samples, and used luminol to detect any traces of blood that might have been cleaned up. The office scissors and the leather belt used in the attack were found near Emily's body, and both were immediately sent to the lab for analysis. But the most important piece of evidence was yet to be discovered. Detectives Mitchell and Lopez knew that in order to fully understand what had led to Emily's murder, they needed to dig deeper into her personal life. They began by interviewing her colleagues in the Navy, hoping to get a better sense of who Emily was outside of her marriage. What they found was a picture of a woman who was highly respected, incredibly disciplined, and deeply private. Emily's colleagues spoke highly of her work ethic and dedication to her career. She was known for being meticulous, always going above and beyond in her duties. But when it came to her personal life, Emily kept her distance. While other officers would socialize after work or share stories about their families, Emily was often quiet, preferring to keep to herself. Many of her colleagues chalked it up to her being introverted, but in light of her murder, the detectives wondered if there was more to her secrecy. Emily, Kate revealed, had been living with a secret one that she had kept from almost everyone in her life, including Daniel. Emily was transgender. She had transitioned several years before meeting Daniel and had legally changed her name and identity. To her colleagues, she was simply Emily Turner, a dedicated Navy officer. But her past was something she had kept hidden, out of fear that it could ruin both her career and her marriage. Kate explained that Emily had confided in her shortly after getting married. She was terrified that Daniel might one day discover her past, and she didn't know how he would react. Emily had always been careful about keeping her medical records and personal documents hidden, but the fear of her secret being exposed weighed heavily on her. In the weeks leading up to her death, Kate noticed that Emily had become more anxious, more withdrawn, and less willing to talk about her home life. This revelation gave the detectives a motive. If Daniel had discovered Emily's transgender identity, it could have led to a violent confrontation. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the detectives still needed more concrete evidence to tie Daniel to the crime. As forensic teams continued to process the Turner residence, they made a discovery that would become a pivotal piece of evidence in the case. In the master bedroom, inside a locked drawer in Emily's nightstand, detectives found her medical records documents that detailed her transition, including her gender reassignment surgery. The drawer was locked, but someone had recently accessed it. Fingerprints on the handle and lock matched Daniel's. This discovery gave detectives Mitchell and Lopez a clearer picture of what had happened. It appeared that Daniel had found the records shortly before the murder, likely leading to the confrontation that ended in Emily's death. The fact that Daniel had accessed the drawer just days before the crime suggested that he had been stewing over the discovery, possibly planning his next move. In addition to the fingerprints on the drawer, forensic teams found Daniel's fingerprints on both the office scissors and the leather belt used in the attack. This further tied him to the crime scene, despite his earlier claims that he had been out with friends during the time of the murder. The forensics team also used blood spatter analysis to reconstruct the crime, revealing that the attack had been violent and prolonged. Emily had fought back, but in the end, she had been overpowered. But the most damning evidence came from Daniel's own phone records. Detectives subpoenaed his phone and found a series of internet searches that painted a disturbing picture. In the days leading up to Emily's death, Daniel had searched for terms like betrayal, transgender deception, and violent confrontations. He had also searched for information about strangulation and how long it would take for someone to die from being choked. These searches indicated that Daniel's attack on Emily may not have been a spontaneous act of rage, but rather a premeditated crime. With this new evidence, Detectives Mitchell and Lopez were ready to confront Daniel. They brought him in for a third round of questioning, this time armed with the knowledge of Emily's secret and the forensic evidence linking him to the crime. When the detectives presented Daniel with the evidence, his demeanor shifted. Gone was the panicked, grieving husband they had seen earlier. Instead, Daniel became cold and detached, refusing to answer their questions. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the detectives knew they had their man. After hours of interrogation, Daniel finally broke. After Daniel's confession, the investigation took a darker turn when detectives discovered the role his mother, Margaret Turner, had played in the events leading up to Emily's murder. Margaret had always been suspicious of Emily, even before the couple got married. She had made it clear to Daniel that she didn't trust Emily and believed she was hiding something. Through phone records and text messages, detectives uncovered a disturbing pattern of communication between Daniel and his mother. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Margaret had been planting seeds of doubt in Daniel's mind, suggesting that Emily was unnatural and not who she claimed to be. She had urged Daniel to dig into Emily's past, insisting that she was hiding something. One text message sent just days before the murder read, "She's lying to you, Daniel. I've known it from the beginning. You need to find out the truth before it's too late." Another message, sent the night before the murder, read, "I told you she wasn't who she says she is. You deserve better than this." Detectives also uncovered a series of conversations in which Margaret had made derogatory remarks about transgender individuals, further fueling Daniel's growing suspicions about Emily. It became clear that Margaret's influence had played a significant role in driving Daniel to confront Emily about her past. Margaret was brought in for questioning, but she denied any involvement in the murder. She admitted that she had been suspicious of Emily and had encouraged Daniel to investigate her past, but she insisted that she had no idea Daniel would resort to violence. Despite her claims of innocence, detectives believed that Margaret's manipulation had played a crucial role in the events leading up to Emily's death. As the investigation continued, more details about Margaret's toxic relationship with Daniel came to light. It became clear that she had always exerted a strong influence over him, and her constant undermining of Emily had contributed to the growing tension in their marriage. While Margaret was not charged in connection with the murder, her role in the tragedy would haunt both her and Daniel for years to come. With the mounting evidence against him, Daniel's confession was inevitable. During a final interrogation, he broke down and admitted to everything. He explained that after finding Emily's medical records, he had been consumed by feelings of betrayal and anger. He couldn't understand why she had kept such a significant part of her life from him, and he felt as though their entire marriage had been built on a lie. Daniel told detectives that on the night of April 17, 2019, he confronted Emily about the records. The argument quickly escalated into a physical altercation, with Daniel accusing Emily of deceiving him. In a fit of rage, he grabbed the office scissors from Emily's desk and stabbed her multiple times. When she fought back, he used the leather belt to strangle her, ensuring that she wouldn't survive. Daniel claimed that he hadn't intended to kill Emily, but the evidence told a different story. The forensic analysis, the internet searches, and the sheer brutality of the attack all pointed to premeditation. Daniel had been stewing over his discovery for days, and when the confrontation finally happened, it was clear that he had already made up his mind about what he was going to do. In his confession, Daniel expressed remorse for what he had done, but the detectives weren't convinced. His cold, detached demeanor during the interrogation suggested that his remorse was more about being caught than about the loss of his wife. He insisted that he had loved Emily, and that her deception had driven him to the breaking point. But for detectives Mitchell and Lopez, there was no justification for the violence he had inflicted on Emily. Daniel was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. As he was led away in handcuffs, the detectives couldn't help but reflect on the tragedy of the situation. Emily had been a dedicated Navy officer, someone who had worked tirelessly to build a new life for herself, only to have it all destroyed by the man who was supposed to love her. The trial of Daniel Turner began in October 2019, drawing national attention due to the sensitive nature of the case. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Karen Mills, argued that Daniel's actions were driven by both transphobia and a deep sense of betrayal. They presented evidence showing that Daniel had discovered Emily's medical records and had been searching for violent solutions online in the days leading up to the murder. Mills portrayed Daniel as a man who couldn't accept the truth about his wife's identity and had lashed out in anger. She argued that the attack was premeditated, pointing to the evidence of his internet searches and the violent nature of the crime. The defense, led by attorney Michael Reed, painted a different picture. Reed argued that Daniel's actions were not motivated by hatred or transphobia, but were instead the result of emotional turmoil. He claimed that Daniel had acted impulsively, overwhelmed by the discovery of Emily's secret, and that the murder was not premeditated. Reed pushed for a lesser charge, arguing that Daniel's mental state at the time of the crime should be taken into account. The courtroom was tense as both sides presented their arguments. Emily's family sat quietly in the gallery, devastated not only by the loss of their daughter, but also by the public exposure of her transgender identity. For them, the trial was not just about seeking justice for Emily's murder. It was about preserving her dignity and memory. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned with a verdict. Daniel Turner was found guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. For some, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but for Emily's loved ones, the pain of her loss would never fully heal. Emily Turner's murder sent shockwaves through both the military and the LGBTQ+ communities. Her death became a flashpoint for discussions about the challenges faced by transgender individuals, particularly those serving in the military. Despite changes in military policy regarding gender identity, Emily's case highlighted the fear and secrecy that many transgender service members still felt. In Jacksonville, the case had a lasting impact. The quiet neighborhood where the Turners lived was forever changed, and neighbors who once believed they knew the couple were left grappling with the truth about what had happened behind closed doors. For Emily's colleagues in the Navy, her death was a tragic reminder of the sacrifices made by service members, both on and off the battlefield. Emily had dedicated her life to her country, but in the end, it was her personal life that led to her untimely death. What are your thoughts on this tragic case? Do you believe justice was served? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Silent Crime Case for more real-life crime stories. Stay safe, true crime case solvers. Until next time.